Well, hello, my name is Simon Duffy. I'm the Director of the Centre for Welfare Reform, and with Marcus Verhaller I also run Citizen Network, which is a global cooperative whose goal is to create a world where everyone matters. And what I wanted to talk about for a little while is the idea of citizenship. Why is citizenship such an important idea? So I've come up with 7 answers, 7 reasons why citizenship is really important, and I was going to talk through some of those things and talk about some of the ideas and philosophy behind citizenship. So let's begin. I think the most obvious reason why citizenship is important is that we all need to belong, and citizenship is one way of belonging. It's also something that can get misunderstood. So one way of understanding citizenship is, or misunderstanding citizenship maybe, is the idea of kind of passport citizenship. Politicians are very fond of this idea of citizenship. You're a citizen if you've got the right passport. You're a citizen of the United States if you've got the right to stay there and we need to build big long walls to keep people out, or you're a citizen of the United Kingdom if you've got the right coloured passport and you protect the seas from refugees. And in this kind of narrow notion of citizenship is really getting citizenship upside down, but it reflects the truth that we do want to belong. It's really interesting actually. A few years ago, our Prime Minister, they've changed a lot in the United Kingdom recently, but we had a Prime Minister called Theresa May, and she stood up and she said, but if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. You don't understand what the very word citizenship means. And of course what she was trying to do in this little speech was to tell all of us who live in the United Kingdom that we should not try and consider ourselves any longer citizens of Europe or citizens of anywhere else. Well, this is kind of ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, I'm a citizen of Sheffield, which is the city I live in. I'm also a citizen of the neighbourhood, which I live in a neighbourhood called Nether Edge. We're in fact all citizens of lots of different things. We all belong at lots of different groups. It's very ironic for the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom even to say that citizenship is just about belonging to a country, because the United Kingdom itself isn't a country. It's 4 countries: England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And everybody who's in the United Kingdom really knows that they're a citizen of one of those places, maybe more than one. I support the English football team. I'm English, although I don't really support the English rugby team. I tend to support the Welsh rugby team or even the New Zealand rugby team, because I kind of think that the English rugby team is quite southern. So what I'm really saying is that our identities are complex, and much better than listening to somebody like Theresa May, we should listen to Nelson Mandela. So Nelson Mandela said, "The time will come when our nation will honour the memory of all the sons, the daughters, the mothers, the fathers, the youth and the children who by their thoughts and deeds gave us the right to assert with pride that we are South Africans, that we are Africans, and that we are citizens of the world." That's a more mature understanding of belonging, because we belong to lots of different things, and belonging is really important. And so what citizenship gives us is a way of belonging, which is really important. The second thing that citizenship gives us is rights. Sometimes people say equal rights, which is kind of true. But it's much more than that. rights are really the means by which we support each other to take our place in society. Rights and the rule of law and the systems of government and all the arrangements we create enable us to live safely, to live well, to get on with each other. That's part of what citizenship is, really. It's part of it's a structure of laws and social arrangements of which rights are a central part, which enables human beings to flourish. If you think about why people flee countries, yes, they're fleeing from war very often. They're fleeing from economic crises, and what they're fleeing to is to some better form of citizenship. That's what people are seeking, quite understandably. And what we want is a world where people don't have to do that, because everywhere people can trust the rule of law, everywhere people are safe and well, and peace reigns. Everywhere citizenship is possible. We often, particularly since after World War II, the emphasis has been on human rights. But of course, the challenge is to make those rights real in our political and legal and social arrangements. It's not enough to have a human right if your society isn't organised to make that right real. And one of the great philosophers of the 20th century was Hannah Arendt, and she explored this issue and also explored the causes of the Holocaust and World War II and the disasters that we saw in the middle of the 20th century, which were disasters which she saw as really the way in which society turned against itself and turned against the weakest members of the society. Famously, of course, Jews, many of them refugees fleeing revolution and war elsewhere, then became subject to prejudice and discrimination in Germany, and then that led to increased anti-Semitism and all the horrors that flowed from that. But as Hannah Arendt and others have observed, what is not sufficiently well understood, the Holocaust actually began with the attacks on disabled people and people with mental illness who were in institutions and who Hitler ordered to be murdered, and which doctors and nurses in those systems continued to murder even after the orders had been ended. And this quote here, which I've put together with a much more recent tragic photo, is by Hannah Arendt, talking about the status of refugees, the comity of European peoples, the ability of European peoples to live together in harmony and to respect each other. It went to pieces when and because it allowed its weakest members to be excluded and persecuted. So it's about respecting rights, but rights is really about respecting the people with the least power. That's what rights are useful for, ensuring that people who are most likely to be disrespected, most likely to be oppressed, have the power to push back, to be strong and to live a decent life. So citizenship is about having those rights and making those rights real. The third thing about citizenship is that it gives us the ability to be free. And this has always been a critical part of citizenship. And I was thinking about this idea in relation to the talk today, and I was reminded of a kind of a very famous passage from ancient literature, which comes from, this book here is by Herodotus, who's the first ever historian, and he wrote a book which described the ancient world 2,500 years ago, or a bit longer, the developments in Athens, the developments in Greece, the developments in Persia, the war between Persia and Greece. And there's a really fascinating passage in this, which is probably not describing accurately what happened, but purports to describe the decision in Persia about what the future form of government should be in Persia. And there's this debate between the most powerful people in Persia about whether Persia should become a democracy, an oligarchy, or a monarchy. And one of the characters here says, I think it's best that we no longer be ruled by one of ourselves as a monarch, since that kind of government is neither pleasant nor good. And he goes on to say, the rule of the majority, however, not only has the most beautiful and powerful name of all, equality, but in practice the majority does not act at all like a monarch. Indeed, the majority chooses its magistrates by lot, it holds all of these officials accountable to an audit, and it refers all resolutions to the authority of the public. I therefore propose that we abandon monarchy and raise the majority to a ruling position, for in the many is the whole. Why am I going back 2,500 years? But this idea of democracy is really the idea that we should be free. Free because we decide what the rules are. We control society. And opposed to that idea is the idea of us not as citizens, but as subjects, subjects of a king, or the other alternative is subjects of an oligarchy. What's an oligarchy? It's not a word we use very much, but basically it's like an aristocracy or a meritocracy, those group of people who decide that they're the best and they in a group will control the rest of us. It's worth thinking about this today because do we live in a democracy? I'm not sure we do. I think that it would be better to think of what we live in today as a more closer to an oligarchy. There's a small number of people, politicians, we do get to choose them, but oligarchies, that system of oligarchies is how they were organised in the ancient world. You would choose between different groups and you would have that one group rule over you rather than another, but it was really that group that was in control. So the idea of citizenship is about freedom, it's about democracy, it's about us all taking control of society and being free and setting our own rules. But arguably it's not something that we're really living, the idea of democracy today. And so what citizenship also does is give us a challenge to create truly democratic societies. This slipperiness of control is part of what we know from the experiences of people with disabilities. A lot of my work has been focused on trying to challenge the way the system, the bureaucracy, takes control of people's lives. A few years ago, or back in the early 90s, I came up with this idea of comparing the professional gift model of services to a citizenship model of services, and that's reflected in this image. On one side, you can see that, services can be organised by us paying taxes to government and government giving that money to professionals or others who will then provide services which we then receive. People have decided how those services should work for us. And for things that are of marginal importance, I don't know, working out how broadband works or how your gas system is delivered, maybe fuel and energy and these things, having a fixed system from above is not too bad. But for people with disabilities, if you find that your housing, your relationships, your job, everything you do with your day is basically decided for you by an institution or a service that's been organised for you in your best interest, supposedly, what you've really done is lost your freedom. So the challenge for people with disabilities, but for many other groups, has been to say, well, we do need resources, we do need support even, but we want to be in control of that. We want to have freedom. So citizenship is about being free. and about having control over how the rules are set. Citizenship is also, interestingly, about having a really good life. Citizenship is a responsibility, but it's also a responsibility to make the best of yourself. It's a responsibility to take on, build a life for yourself, which is meaningful for you. Citizens don't live lives according to other people's idea of what's important. Citizens lead lives in accordance with what's important to themselves. And this idea has been important for me too. A few years ago, I wrote a book called The Keys to Citizenship, which, with my friend Wendy Perez, we developed that idea a little bit further. And so over the last few years, we've been talking about the 7 keys to citizenship. And that's pictured in this kind of graphic here. And what that's really saying is that if you think about how citizenship works, actually at the heart of it is the need to have a life of meaning. I say, meaningful for you. To make that life become real, you also need freedom, you need some resources, you need a place where you belong, you need some assistance, but assistance that you can control. You need to be part of the community and part of the life of the community, and you need fundamentally, and always the most important part of life, is you need love. So this notion of citizenship is something we can think about as a way of thinking about our own lives, and it's also something we should think about when we are supposedly trying to offer people help and assistance. Because if our help and assistance isn't helping people build good lives, then what is it doing? How can we be helping people well if at the same time we're lowering their control over their own lives, if we're lowering their own ability to lead a life that's meaningful for them, or to develop the resources that give them status and respect in the community? So citizenship is a goal for ourselves. It's something that is also available to everyone. Part of the purpose of the book was to show that for people with intellectual disabilities, citizenship is completely possible. Yes, maybe some people need some assistance making decisions, but that's something we know we can do something about. We can help people in the right way so that they can still be in control of their own lives. We can make resources available in the right way so that people can have flexibility to build a life that makes sense to them, in the community they need to be. So we know how to do these things, but there's still many, many people who are not being allowed to live lives of full citizenship. And there are many, many wealthy, rich people who are leading empty lives that are not lives of citizenship. So this isn't just about, it's not the rich who define what citizenship is, it's not the powerful who define what citizenship. Citizenship is something that we do together and is available to all of us. The other thing about citizenship is that I think it gives us an idea of what it means to be included, to be truly part of a community as an equal. Again, this is something that you hear when you go back in time and listen to the ancient Greeks think about citizenship. It's also a theme you can find in the Bible and in other ancient literature, which is the notion that what we're trying to do is really welcome each other as equals. That there are barriers to seeing each other as equals. There are labels, there are walls, but we can overcome those. There's a beautiful quote here, which I'll read. A rabbi asked his students how they could tell when the dawn had come and morning prayers could be said. One student responded by saying, "When you can see the sheep on the hill Another suggested that one can tell that the dawn had come when a person is able to distinguish between a fig tree and a grapevine. No, said the wise one. It is dawn when you can look into the faces of human beings and you have enough light within you to recognise them as your sisters and brothers. So I think citizenship gives us an ideal for inclusion. Citizenship means that we can be different and welcomed in as an equal. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about citizenship. We can be different and equal. In fact, in a way, you can't but be different if you're a true citizen. I mean, citizens are people leading meaningful, unique lives of value. They're not drones, they're not robots, they're not subject-gated entities. They're not all part of the matrix. We're free, we're different, we are each unique, and yet we can treat each other with respect, and yet we can choose to treat each other as equals. We can recognise that each person has that absolute value as an equal human being. The other reason I think that citizenship is really important, and this sounds like a funny way of putting it, but we need citizenship if we're going to save the planet. We're in a severe ecological crisis, which is not only damaging the environment, not only increasing global temperatures, it's leading to species extinction, and it's threatening the very existence of human beings themselves. How are we going to do anything about that? Well, we have to take responsibility, don't we? I mean, if we just sit here and wait for somebody else to solve these problems, why do we believe that's going to work? I mean, one of the most inspiring people in the last few years has been is super citizen Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg, who is a young woman, I think she also has a disability, Asperger's syndrome. She has made this very simple point that if we do not each take responsibility, campaigning responsibility, but also practical responsibility for trying to change our own lives, change our own homes, make the world carbon neutral, everything will go to hell. So we need to be citizens in order to save the planet. And the last thing is that we need to be citizens if we're going to learn how to do things differently. We need to be citizens to work together to do things differently. One of the problems, I think, is that we constantly expecting solutions to be delivered by some kind of power, when actually we know a lot of what the problems are and we know what a lot of the solutions are, but we don't ourselves behave as if that it's our responsibility to share learning, to make a difference. So citizens do a really simple, fundamental thing. They cooperate. They work together. That's one of the reasons why we created Citizen Network. What we wanted to do was start to encourage people to not look upwards for solutions, but to look outwards for solutions. What we wanted to do was help people make it easier to cooperate, share information, share good ideas, get people working in partnership. So the whole of Citizen Fest is a kind of model of what we think the future should look like. It's a world where we can just share our good stuff and begin to make the changes we need. So really, that's what I want to end on. I mean, citizenship is something that's essential. It's something that's fun, it's brilliant. At some level, it's kind of easy, though each of us has got to find the right way of being a citizen for us. But if that sounds good to you, why don't you come and join us in Citizen Network? Thanks. Hi there. So my name's Simon Duffy. I'm the Director of the Centre for Welfare Reform, and I also lead Citizen Network, which is a global cooperative and one of the organisations behind Citizen Fest, which this talk is part of. And I'm going to talk about the COVID-19 crisis. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've seen governments do and what we've seen people do. And I'm going to talk also about what this crisis teaches us about the importance of basic income, which is an idea which I'll explain a little bit more about as we go on. But I'm mindful that not everybody watching this film will be coming from the United Kingdom, so some of my stories and examples are definitely based in the United Kingdom. Many countries have responded to COVID better than the United Kingdom. In fact, I think there are very few countries who have done as poorly as the United Kingdom in responding to the COVID-19 crisis. So hopefully in your country things may be better than this, but I think it's very revealing, and I think the lessons do go wider than the United Kingdom. In the early days of the crisis, from a UK perspective, what was clear was that there was just some sense of denial that this contagious, infectious and dangerous virus was coming our way. The idea that this virus was in China and that things were going on in China, and that all looked very concerning, but it was certainly perceived as a Chinese problem, a Chinese virus, if you like. A little bit later, when the cases of COVID-19 seemed to radically increase in Italy and the medical system in Italy started to come under extreme pressure, there was a little bit more awareness, but even then, for weeks and weeks, politicians were still treating this as a problem that was somewhere else. And I guess that's natural enough, but again, it shows you how in a world which is so interconnected and which is where diseases can spread, as they always have through history, but we can discover that diseases are spreading and we can share information very quickly, and we can cooperate internationally. I guess the lesson is that we haven't woken up to how effective we could be if we really got our act together. Clearly, Korea, China, Japan, countries that had previously experienced the SARS virus, which was very similar, were better equipped. So they knew what to do and they were much better at controlling the infections. Countries like the United Kingdom had actually made savings in public health and in the health service and stripped away some of the provisions that would have allowed us to respond more quickly. So yes, we were not well prepared. What was slightly more worrying was that in some of the early responses by government, you almost got a sense that they didn't really mind if people died from the virus. Clearly the virus is much more dangerous for older people. There was, in the right-wing newspaper in the United Kingdom, which is called the Daily Telegraph, one journalist wrote merrily that, well, the virus might help us with our social care problem. In other words, older people dying will reduce costs and that will somehow be better. And very quickly in the discussion, you realise that for political leaders, money, the economy, what they consider to be the economy, what they consider to be valuable, was much more at the forefront of their thinking than human lives. So we had this notion of herd immunity was suddenly drawn out, that somehow, well, if lots of people caught it, then that would be okay because they would get immunity. Now, bear in mind that I don't think, even at this stage, and now we're many months, this is September now, we know very little about immunity to this virus. So this is all wishful thinking. There was talk about shielding vulnerable people. Somehow they would be protected, and shielding people in residential care, which were perceived to be people who would be at very much greater risk. The frightening thing is that all of this was just talk. in the very early days when the government did start to panic, one of the first things they do was instruct hospitals to discharge patients willy-nilly into residential care. So many of these patients would have been infected with COVID-19, and we've seen thousands of people die in residential care services because, for all the talk of shielding, actually the government was, if you like, injecting the virus transmitted by people into the residential care sector. So this has been another very depressing side of the response to COVID-19 in the United Kingdom. We can see that the government really doesn't seem to value the lives of older people, the lives of disabled people, the lives of people experiencing chronic illness. All the people who are most vulnerable were really put at greater risk through government policy. So that was a sad lesson. The other really interesting thing, and again, I think for instance, many people in other countries will not really understand how centralised the United Kingdom is. So although we have local governments, local government has very little power. It has no constitutional status in the United Kingdom, and it has very little finance given to it from central government, and very little self-generated finance. So it's a very thin veneer of government, and since 2010, central government has targeted its austerity cuts on local government. So local government has even got weaker and weaker over the last 10 years. Now, the thing is, when you look at crisis response, the one thing that's clear is that you need local capacity and local leadership. We've already seen this in Asia, where actually, if you can organise effectively, then you can keep the virus contained in a smaller geographical area. But you need good local organisation to do that. And this is something that the UK really doesn't have. So the fact that local government is very weak, has very few resources. The health service itself isn't accountable to local government, it's accountable to central government. All of these things further created problems. So there was very little capacity to do adequate testing, and that remains a huge problem today. Very little capacity for local authorities to take a leadership, to make decisions on their own, to get the necessary resources to act. Instead, you had central government behaving like it was going to be the solution to this problem. And again, this is the reverse of what you want in response to a major pandemic. You want local power, local authority, local decision-making, quick action. Instead, we got centralised power, slow responses, confusion, bureaucracy, and then very worryingly, a lot of corruption started to creep in. So as the government wanted to do things quickly, panicked, it started to, government ministers start talking to their friends say, oh, well, we could do testing, we could provide you with equipment, and suddenly millions of pounds starts going on to being transferred to private businesses with no capacity to really respond appropriately to the problems. I mean, an example of this was that the government managed to purchase a whole load of protective equipment, shields, all of the gloves from Turkey, from a t-shirt manufacturer who had no experience. Eventually, when these supplies were talked about in the news media as coming, and this is meant to be good news, when they finally arrived, they weren't fit for purpose. So this is what you get with incompetent bureaucracy making decisions, politicians in a hurry making decisions they're not competent to make. The people who know about protective equipment in the health service and local government don't have the power, don't have the authority, don't have the resources. And so the response is being driven by the wrong people. So this is, this has been a repeated pattern, and there's been no real change so far in the United Kingdom. So lots and lots of problems. So COVID-19 in a way has really shone a sharp light on the kind of structural incompetence of the United Kingdom. And I think, like, the United States has not done terribly well. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, has been clearly incompetent and out of his depth with response to COVID, has underplayed the seriousness of the problem. But the United States has states, and those states have authority, and a lot of the good practice comes because states and counties can act. And similarly, Germany and Iceland and everywhere really in the world has better central local government relationships and greater clarity and more local services that it can call on. It's clearly very important that central government takes a lead, but it's really important that central government also allows leadership to be in place right across our communities. So we really saw a vacuum of local leadership, good people in those local communities, don't get me wrong, good people in public services, but really not having the authority to make decisions and not having the resources to empower those decisions. Those are some of the negatives. In a way, what we learned was our government was not equipped. It was clear from some of the reporting that the government also thought that we, the people, would be incompetent. A lot of discussion that if lockdown arrangements were put in place, we'd all break them because we couldn't cope. And this is it's not surprising maybe that people who have a lot of power and think that they're right to have that power have a very low opinion of ordinary people. But again, what we saw was the opposite of what they believed. In fact, ordinary people have been generally very responsible. Lockdown was followed very well, a lot of self-discipline by ordinary citizens, and that continues to be the case despite a kind of constant confused messaging from central government, which probably is actually making things a bit harder now because nobody's really clear what they should or shouldn't be doing. And again, if you've got messaging coming out centrally and then very, very weak systems locally, you can't really get your messaging right for the kind of problem that you've got. So, government doesn't trust the people, but the people really did a great job. One of the most important things that happened, and I think that I think many of us, that this could be a real turning point in the development of our society, is that communities just got themselves organised. Hundreds of thousands of communities just got themselves organised. People used Facebook and WhatsApp, I think primarily, other social media as well, but those seem to be the two main ones. So Facebook provided people to create ways of coordinating at a local level, at an area level, at a kind of regional level. So groups start to communicate, self-organised groups. Local people start to take responsibility. Leadership starts to emerge in streets, in neighbourhoods. People start to check out whether people are all right. Little WhatsApp groups come up. People start asking for assistance, volunteering assistance. An enormous wave of energy. Again, it was really striking that central government at the same time was putting a lot of emphasis on the need for volunteering, but it said the way to volunteer is to go online and volunteer for the NHS volunteering scheme. This has been a disaster. I think 750,000 people, I believe, signed up for this, and I've spoken to many people who never did any actual volunteering. There were weeks of training that led to nothing, because by the time, again, this is a classic problem, by the time that they had been trained to assist and gone through all the hoops, actually that things had moved on, they weren't needed. What the government had trained them for wasn't what actually needed to happen. The great thing about mutual aid, of course, is there's none of that. People are helping each other out as neighbours. People are not only responding sensitively and quickly to things that are immediate problems to them that they can see or that their neighbours can see, but they're also building relationships through this process, aren't they? Whereas in the government scene, when it did work, what it meant was that you would somehow volunteer to do some task that you'd been informed was needed on a mobile phone. And you're doing that task completely disconnected from the social relationships, completely disconnected from your particular neighbourhood. So again, what you see is a kind of like a lumpen, kind of giant state trying to help people be neighbours, help people volunteer, but those are micro tasks. Those are things that can only really happen at the level of the individual and the level of the neighbourhood. When the state tries to organise them, it just ends up with disorganisation. The response of local government generally, I think, to all of this, it was much better than central government, and certainly places I know like Barnsley were very sensitive. Barnsley is a town in the north of England. Local leaders were very clear there that they needed to support the community action, encourage community action, enable that, not get in its way. Civil society, what we might think of as the traditional charities, community organisations, the organised bit of community life, also I think has generally been very helpful. Although it's interesting, I think, that they have struggled also to just let go. What you see sometimes is, I think in Sheffield I saw an instruction which was, you know, you can volunteer for these kind of things if you are an accredited volunteer, because you'll be insured, but don't do those kind of things if you're just doing it on your own. Well, of course, I don't think that's how neighbourliness works. I don't think we police check ourselves. We have to trust ourselves. And I don't think we're going to get the most out of people if we push them through these kind of hoops, even if they're a bit smaller and a bit quicker than the government hoops. Really, what communities demonstrated they could do, wanted to do, had the capacity to do, was just help in an ordinary way. So that's been amazing. There are a lot of things that this can teach us. And I want to draw attention to two things. The first thing is what I would call neighbourhood democracy, the need for neighbourhood democracy. The Centre for Welfare Reform, I think, which is a think tank based in the north of England, I think for us this is the key to transforming public policy over the next 50 years. I hope we can move things along quickly, but of course there's a lot of resistance to these ideas. But ultimately what we need to see, I think, is the reorganisation of power on a neighbourhood level. Neighbourhoods, which could be thousands of people,